Today we're going to look at multi-use trail safety along with 4 common design and build mistakes that compromise safety for trail users. But before we start, let's take a look at the standard we're going to use for trail safety. You could make the case that the fatality rates on U.S. roadways rival war zones. In 2016, there were over 37,000 traffic deaths altogether, nearly 6,000 of which were pedestrians. In fact, if you add up all the fatalities that were non-occupants of motorized vehicles that year, that number is nearly 20%, or nearly 1 out of every 5 fatalities. Most people agree that these fatality rates are not acceptable. As a result, many communities are adopting Vision Zero policies. It's become the ambitious gold standard for transportation safety, and we're going to use Vision Zero as our standard for multi-use trails as well. Because trail corridors are also transportation corridors. For years, we've been told that most trips we take are short and close to home. Today, many people don't need a car to make those trips, thanks to growing bikeway and trail networks. And with the growing popularity of e-bikes or electric bikes and other personal conveyance devices, these corridors will continue to see increased growth in the coming years. So, how do we make sure these corridors, in this case multi-use trails, are safe? Let's start by taking a lesson from roadway design. Roadways are built with forgiving design elements. Here we see a wide lane with a paved shoulder and rumble strips as an example. We design this way because we know drivers have errors in judgment and make mistakes from time to time. In cars, we also install crumple zones, seat belts, and airbags to further protect occupants. These are all worthwhile safety measures. However, when it comes to trails, something rather important changes. The forgiving principle afforded roadway design is often missing here. So what does that mean? Well, we know trail users, like drivers, also make mistakes. However, many trail builders do not allow for that. For example, as seen here, many continue to place solid objects directly on trails. That's not something you're likely to see on any roadway, and for good reason. Sooner or later, someone will collide with these objects. Keep in mind that the trail user has none of the protections given drivers. No protective shell, no airbags. In a collision with a solid object on the trail user is the crumple zone. So we'll call this mistake number 1, placing solid objects on multi-use trails. Bollards, often being the most common objects used, have done considerable damage. Giuseppe Miano, mentioned here, was one of 2 people whose bollard crashes on the same Ohio trail led to their deaths. It should also be noted that lawsuits can accompany these tragic crashes. Since bollards have been widely used on multi-use trails for decades, over time their danger has been demonstrated. Here are the facts in this matter. Due to fatalities and serious injuries that have occurred as a result of placing objects on multi-use trails, this practice is no longer recommended. In fact, this treatment, or method if you like, has been recognized as a hazard to trail users, as can be seen here in this Federal Highway Administration doc. Yet, the practice of using these objects on trails continues in many areas, despite the fact that it is both dangerous and often ineffective. Not only do these objects often not fulfill their intended purpose, they jeopardize safety on the trail simply by being placed there. In the end, since they often don't prevent car intrusion, they really only serve as a marker or signal to drivers that car encroachment is not permitted. This is crucial to understanding this issue and worth repeating. These objects often only serve as warning signs. And of course, there are much safer methods for warning drivers that don't put trail users at risk and would meet Vision Zero standards. It's quite simple. If you don't place a solid object, like a bollard, on a trail, there is 0 chance for any such collision. However, the trailside bollard pictured here also poses a hazard. Let's look at that next. Mistake number 2 is not having a proper buffer zone. As I mentioned, trail users, like drivers, also make mistakes and can wander off the trail from time to time. To make sure they can do so without incident, a clear zone, or buffer zone, as I'm calling it here, is needed. This zone is along both edges of the trail, similar to a road shoulder along a roadway. This area requires a firm, mostly level surface that has a smooth transition onto the trail and is free of solid objects. The National Association for City Transportation Officials recommends a 4-foot minimum setback for trail signs. Other solid objects should also meet this minimum standard or exceed it. Again, the principle here is straightforward. If a proper buffer zone is in place, users can wander off the trail without harm. But if objects are placed there, or uneven or loose surfaces such as loose gravel are next to a trail instead, users can and will crash. These hazards can take many different forms. As you can see here, these setback requirements are not always strictly followed by trail builders, despite the important role they play in maintaining safety. Inadequate buffer zones can be the result of poor design, but they can also be man-made or occur through erosion. Trailside erosion is a common danger on rail trails in Ohio. It can take the form of a large chunk of missing embankment or a smaller hole, like the one pictured here. This hole is about 4 to 5 feet wide and about 2.5 to 3 feet high below the bottom of the fence line shown here. Once a small child's bike wheel wanders off the edge of the trail at a spot like this, gravity will take over and do the rest. Now let's take a look at how buffer zones should look. The photo on the left shows a very generous buffer that is nearly as wide as the trail itself. The large rocks shown here were used to prevent drivers from parking too close to the trail. Setback specifications only recommend a minimum distance that an object should be placed away from a trail. Here, that minimum standard was exceeded, thereby increasing the margin for safety. Mistake number 3, pinch points. Narrowing an already narrow trail surface reduces safety to a greater extent than most people realize. Here's how. We start with the reduced width at the pinch point example shown here, which is 8 feet 2 inches on this otherwise 10-foot wide trail. But as it turns out, this is not usable space, as my mountain bike handlebars would strike the solid objects at either edge of the trail. So I moved my bike toward the middle of the trail, away from the objects, to see where it needed to be to just brush by. That distance was 12 inches less. Now here's where understanding user dynamics comes into play. No one likes riding close enough to solid objects to risk hitting them. So users will create their own buffer zone and leave more space, barring errors in their judgment, of course. That buffer space will vary from rider to rider, but let's say users allow a very minimal 6-inch clearance on each side for this example. That will further reduce the space by another foot. So now we've come to the most important measurement, the actual usable space. And here it is, 6 feet 2 inches, a roughly 40% reduction from the original trail width. And remember, that's for 2 lanes of travel. So let's take stock of the safety issues found here. We have solid objects funneling users into a significantly reduced space. In addition, there is no buffer zone at this point, therefore no margin for error exists. Trail users cannot step or move off the trail to avoid others where there is no buffer zone. Add in the fact that this pinch point is placed on a curve where oncoming users will not be seen well in advance, and you have an increased likelihood for collisions here. But there's more going on here. From this perspective of this same example, if a trail user decides not to follow the trail and bear left, but instead to continue straight to cross the crosswalk, there are 2 walk signal posts directly in their path. Note that there is no actual stop here. The trail continues along the curve to the left. However, the stop sign was likely added in an attempt to mitigate the dangers created here. When working from a mostly blank canvas, as was the case on this project, the solution is to be aware of these problematic layouts so they can be avoided during the design phase. Mistake number 4, not understanding how multi-use trails are used. Understanding user behavior and how people interact with trail infrastructure can lead to improved designs and safer layouts. The bench next to the trail, as seen here, is a common mistake. Not only is the object in the buffer zone, but little thought was given as to how these rest areas are used. When a small group stops to rest, it often looks like this. With benches, the minimum required setback would not be nearly enough to ensure that those resting would not block the trail. Users stopped on the trail is not something you want on corridors that are designed for movement and travel. This example demonstrates how you can avoid this problem simply by anticipating user behavior. Now let's look at how to avoid these 4 mistakes. If we start simply with no solid objects on or next to the trail and provide a smooth, level buffer zone, we've gone much further than many have in regard to trail safety. Also, avoid pinch points by design in all new trail construction. When you have a blank canvas, utilize the space fully. No pinch points means no compromise in safety. When routing a multi-use trail through existing built environments, avoid the easy, unsafe option of simply narrowing the trail to squeeze through. Consider user dynamics, how the trail is being used, and design accordingly to maximize safety. So, if we were to distill these suggestions all down into one basic rule, it would be this: design, build, and maintain your multi-use trail in a way that avoids introducing or creating any hazards like those shown in this video. Following these basic principles goes a long way toward maximizing safety, and it's a big step toward the Vision Zero gold standard as well. I would be remiss in not including this high-profile example of some of the points we've covered so far. This is the bikeway in New York City where the terror attack took place in October 2017, when a man drove a truck onto the bikeway and killed 8 people and injured 12 others. Thanks to the response by officials there, this is now likely one of the most dangerous bikeways in the U.S., regardless of whether another terror attack ever takes place there. Of course, many communities market their trails and bikeways to attract visitors as well as professionals to their area. Giuseppe was one such visitor. He was an Italian national living and working in Ohio for about a year and a half on a job assignment. He was doing the very thing we encourage residents as well as visitors to do, to enjoy the trails and be active. And that's precisely how he died. Looking back on his crash, we now know this: if the trail had been built using the forgiving principle, there would have been no objects on the trail for him to collide with. But instead, his life was taken by crashing into a bollard placed in the middle of the trail that, in theory, was supposed to help keep him safe. He was not the first person to be injured or die this way, and sadly, he won't be the last. Because wherever these dangers are put in place or allowed to remain in place, they will continue to take their toll over time. All trail users deserve facilities that meet the highest standard of safety, Vision Zero. But that does require a commitment to existing safety standards and an understanding of how people use these facilities. And as demonstrated in this video, adhering to sound safety principles in the design and build phase goes a long way toward making your local multi-use trail a safer one. Safer for you, your family and community, and visitors as well. Thank you for watching.